Hello, welcome to New Scientist Weekly. This is the podcast where we select the best and most intriguing of the week's science stories. I'm Rowan Hooper in London.
And I'm Christy Taylor in New York. This week on the pod, we are going quite a few different places. There is the successful freezing and thawing of human brain tissue, which is a really exciting breakthrough that could fuel better brain research. And we visit the rainforest of Costa Rica, where we learn what healthy ecosystems sound like. Here is a bit of a teaser.
And I've got a fascinating tale of parental care, but in orchids. Plus, why archaeologists think the Nile River once had another major branch, which is now just a hostile strip of desert.
But we're going to start with a story about advanced alien civilisations. And maybe we don't mean science fiction. Rowan, I have to say, if I could raise a single eyebrow, if I had that skill, I would be doing that right now.
You mean you didn't practice in front of a mirror when you were a kid?
I did, but I just never figured it out.
This is a great story. It's about the possible detection of Dyson spheres around stars in our galaxy. To discuss this momentous news, we're joined by New Scientist news editor Jacob Aaron. Jacob, remind us first what a Dyson sphere is.
So this was an idea first dreamt up by physicist Freeman Dyson, and he suggested that you could build a structure surrounding an entire star to absorb their energy, and this would be a way that advanced aliens could draw huge amounts of power.
I love the imagination to just come up with that sort of an idea. But what's perhaps even more extraordinary is there's some evidence for this now. Is that it? Is that right?
Well, so if these objects do exist, they should be warm enough to give off a detectable infrared glow, what astronomers call a technosignature, and this could alert us to their presence. And in fact, now 2 teams of astronomers, using data from surveys of 5 million stars from the Gaia satellite and from infrared survey results on the ground and space telescopes, they have turned up signs of excess infrared heat that can't be explained by known natural processes.
Ooh, so a few stars are too hot, Jacob, and so these scientists are suggesting they might be Dyson spheres?
Yes, so I think they're saying it's consistent with Dyson spheres, not that they definitely are.
All right, okay, well, we wouldn't expect that, definitely. But tell us more.
So this is a story by reporter Jonathan O'Callaghan, and it's about 2 different teams of astronomers. So one team spotted these infrared signals at 7 red dwarf stars within 900 light years of Earth. These are stars that are smaller and dimmer than our own sun, but they appeared up to 60 times brighter in infrared than was expected. Another team saw similar signatures at a further 53 stars. These were at distances up to 6,500 light years. And they think to account for this, up to 16% of each star would have to be covered up. So this would actually be more of a Dyson swarm, a collection of large satellites orbiting the star rather than a complete sphere.
Did the astronomers set out with this in mind, that they might be able to use this survey to look for Dyson spheres or swarms?
So what's nice here is they're using data that's been taken for other purposes. So Gaia, it's this massive survey. Loads of different astronomers use it for all sorts of things.
Right.
But they're able to take that data and actually say, okay, we want to explicitly look for Dyson sphere candidates. Can we see any?
I love that they've been these sensible astronomers looking for this, doing this sort of work.
I mean, I feel like I would only want sensible astronomers on this kind of a hunt, Rowan. I mean, anyone not sensible would just get too wild too fast. But are there any non-alien explanations for these kinds of too hot stars?
So there are a few possibilities. One is that the stars are surrounded by hot planet-forming debris disks. But this would only really happen with young stars, and most of the stars the teams found appeared to be much older than we would expect to see these disks. Another possibility is just purely by coincidence. Each of these stars could be in front of a distant galaxy that's giving off an infrared glow, so the signal's not actually coming from the star itself.
I detect that you're feeling skeptical about these explanations, that you're leaning towards the alien explanation.
Yeah, I mean, having up to 60 stars where you just happen to have a galaxy in the right place, I guess if you're looking at 5 million stars, it's not impossible. I'd say I'm agnostic, unless you think we're the only planet with life in the galaxy, there's no reason that couldn't be aliens. But really, we don't know enough to say for sure. The James Webb Space Telescope could potentially gather more infrared data and give us a closer look. But even then, I'm not going to be waving the it's aliens flag just yet.
I wouldn't expect you to. Look, one thing I found interesting about this is how it relates to what's called the Kardashev scale for advanced civilizations and the great filter idea. Jacob, you'll know about this, right?
Yeah, so this is an idea that you can categorize planetary civilizations according to how much energy they can harness. If you can harness all of your planet's energy, you're a type 1 civilization. If you can harness all of your star's energy, perhaps by using a Dyson sphere, you're a type 2 civilization. And for the record, humanity is estimated to be about a type 0.7. So we've got a bit of a way to go.
I mean, I hate to be the doomer in the chat, but doesn't it seem like reaching a full 1 would require a lot more fossil fuel consumption, for example, or something like that?
That would be the case, but I guess if we're able to use all possible energy sources on Earth, we would also be able to...
it's actually it means you have to capture all the solar energy.
Oh.
So it would be using all the solar energy of the sun to get to that. It's about energy use.
So it doesn't have to be old solar energy stored in oil.
Exactly.
Okay.
But you mentioned the climate crisis, and we're at 0.7. It's maybe unlikely that we'll get to 1 on the scale. But the other thing that I was thinking about this is that I forgot that the scale continues after type 2. And it really gets ludicrous if you get to a type 3 civilization, because then you can capture supposedly all the energy in your galaxy. So, I mean, that made me think, say we have detected these Dyson spheres, right? It might seem strange then that the civilizations stop at Dyson spheres and haven't moved on in the billions of years that we've had to get to type 3. So maybe we should look at flickering galaxies now to look for, type 3 aliens.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that the universe is not yet old enough to produce a type 3 civilization if you really have to be incredibly advanced.
Well, and this is all so much fun to talk about. And Rowan, I love how excited you are. But we do need to return to Earth. We have a lot to do to confirm that these things would even be Dyson spheres. And I imagine there's a long way to go before we can even begin to say that. But we are your number 1 Dyson sphere news source, and we'll be sure to let you know if advanced alien civilizations are conclusively detected. Next up, we've got exciting new research on how to safely freeze human brain tissues without destroying them in the process, which would not just be a fun party trick, but could vastly contribute to medical research into brain disorders and medications. Health editor Alexandra Thompson is here. Hey, Alex.
Hi there.
Okay, so clearly we're not talking about the fun kind of brain freeze, but why is it so hard to freeze a brain in the first place?
Right, so freezing the brain isn't actually the hard part. It's thawing it out and expecting it to still look like a brain that is the big problem here. So this is true of most organs, really. I mean, when you freeze tissue, you get ice crystals between cells. And ice takes up much more space than water, and that can then cause a lot of damage. So it disrupts chemical processes, bursts cell membranes, and with the brain specifically, it disrupts the neural pathways as well. And even if you can freeze organs very quickly without creating these ice crystals, the thawing process is its own challenge, really, since uneven thawing can also cause damage. So you mentioned brain research. That's why this has been such a blockade to better drugs and therapies. So researchers want to be able to preserve brain tissue with freezing, but then be able to see it as it appears during life, and even observe cellular functions in thawed tissue, and that's whether it's healthy or diseased in some way. I mean, both are really important for us to observe.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know we've only just figured out even thawing frozen kidneys and still have them be usable as organs. What's new in the brain department?
So it was a team at Fudan University in Shanghai, in China, and there's quite a few steps to this. So at the very beginning, they started with organoids, which are these small self-organising brain samples that start out as stem cells. And they let these organoids grow for about 3 weeks, which is long enough to develop neurons and neuronal stem cells, which become different kinds of other brain cells. And then they started putting these organoids in sort of chemical cocktails that they thought might help keep the cells alive during the processes of freezing and thawing.
Oh, this is really cool, isn't it? Because I know in many cold-tolerant insects and fish and frogs, they use antifreeze, and they have this mixture of, sugars and salts that helps them stay alive in sub-zero conditions. So is that what we're looking for, an antifreeze that works for mammal cells, brain cells?
Yeah, actually. They soaked the organoids in many different compounds, so antifreeze and different sugars, and they stored them in liquid nitrogen. Then they thawed everything out and looked at the rates of cell death that had occurred, as well as whether there'd been any new growth of neurites. And they repeated that with different combinations of the most successful chemicals. And by the end, they narrowed it down to a combination of ingredients. So that was methylcellulose, ethylene glycol, something called DMSO, and finally another compound called Y27632.
Okay, so quite a cocktail of ingredients.
Yeah, so thankfully they shortened it to MEDI for short.
Right.
And the most amazing thing is that after they tried using MEDI on samples of different ages, they found that the organoids were highly similar to the ones that had never been frozen, even if they'd been frozen for 18 months.
Okay, I mean, that's really nice, but organoids are tiny, aren't they? I mean, have they looked at actual human brain tissue? Because it's not the same as a fully grown brain, is it?
No, it's not. And that was the final step of the research. They took fresh cubes of brain tissue that had been biopsied from a 9-month-old girl with epilepsy.
Wow.
And then they placed those in MEDI and then froze and thawed them. And they found that the tissue both maintained its original structure, including markers of epilepsy, and continued to remain active in the lab culture for at least 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. So they really did achieve like a sample that they could then potentially study, for example. So do we know why MEDI is such an effective compound then for keeping cells cell-shaped?
We don't know exactly. I mean, there's speculation from the team that what MEDI is doing is interfering with a chemical pathway in cells that would normally tell them to die in response to being frozen. So if they don't get that signal, they just don't die.
Mm.
So it's very exciting, all in all.
I love this, and it sounds like a really great step toward understanding brain function and disorder. And as we've been sort of in a science fiction space today already, I also can't help but wonder if there's going to be any progress towards, that whole idea of freezing people whole to enable century-long space travel, with help from technology like this, the dream of cryopreservation.
Well, I don't know if that is such a sci-fi idea. I mean, there's already companies that allow people to freeze their bodies. Isn't Walt Disney a famous example?
That's an urban
Isn't he
myth.
frozen?
I looked it up.
Oh.
Yeah, he's cremated and in a
Yeah.
standard
why is that
grave.
persevered? Okay, so not Walt Disney, but maybe other folks are lining up. We're a long way, I think, from freezing entire brains. One researcher speculated that in coming decades or maybe centuries is more realistic, we might see freezing and thawing that could allow us to help give people with terminal conditions more time to find treatments. But yeah, without getting morbid, if it's centuries, we might not see it unless we're frozen.
We've steered pretty close to science fiction this week, but on next week's Culture Lab, we're going to lean fully into this. I've been talking to our sci-fi columnist and author, Emily Wilson, about all things sci-fi, from some of our favourite classics, new authors, and what science gets from sci-fi. That's coming on Tuesday.
Plus, usually we're the ones telling you all about things, but we're hoping that you can take a few minutes to talk to us. We are conducting a reader survey to help us better understand how you experience New Scientist. We are constantly working to improve what we do, and because you are the whole point of everything we do, we want to hear from you. The survey is over at newscientist.com/survey.
In exchange for just a bit of your time, survey participants will be in for a chance to win a £100 or local equivalent Amazon gift card. So check it out at newscientist.com/survey, and we really appreciate your time on this. And we're back. Next up, we have reporter James Dineen, who's just back from a trip to Costa Rica, where researchers are using sound to study biodiversity across the country's forests. By some measures, it's the largest such ecoacoustic survey ever conducted. There's a feature in the magazine this week all about the survey and how researchers are increasingly using sound to monitor ecosystems. But look, given the acoustic nature of the story, we thought, James, we've got to get you on the podcast, so welcome back.
Thanks very much.
Before we play any forest sounds, look, explain to us what they're doing. What are they trying to learn by capturing sounds from the forests in Costa Rica?
Yeah, so this survey is being led by a doctoral researcher at ETH Zurich in Switzerland named Giacomo Delgado, and his idea is to use sound as a measure of ecosystem health in Costa Rica's forests. In lots of ways, Costa Rica is seen as an ecosystem restoration success story. It had really high rates of deforestation just a few decades ago, but managed to turn those around, and now much of the country's forests have grown back. But it isn't yet clear to what extent the return of all those trees has also meant the return of Costa Rica's biodiversity. And the soundscapes of all these forests could reveal exactly where this biodiversity has returned and where it hasn't.
Okay, well, dig into that a bit, but how can you use sound to measure something as complex as ecosystem health?
It's a good question, and it's not at all straightforward. For instance, you have to think about how species that don't make sounds are represented by acoustic data. There are other questions too, like how soundscapes change with the weather in different seasons and how different types of forests naturally sound different. But for this survey in Costa Rica, the basic idea is to compare soundscapes from well-protected forests with forests that are in the process of growing back, as well as with more degraded areas like pastures or plantations. And that involves hiding microphones in the forest at hundreds of sites in every major type of forest ecosystem across the country. By the end of the survey, they aim to have almost a decade worth of audio data.
Currently, I'm just picturing like a monkey finding one of those microphones and just starting its own podcast. But
They actually did say that sometimes it's a problem when a cicada lands on a microphone.
Oh my gosh.
Because it will just sit there for hours and all you can hear is the screaming cicada. Totally ruins the data.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so remote sensing, maybe like a satellite will tell you that trees have grown back. But as you're saying, you need sound to know what's happening at a more granular level. But surely a decade of sound is way too much for someone to sit there and listen through.
It is. And a big question in the field of bioacoustics or ecoacoustics at the moment is how to go about analyzing these huge volumes of acoustic data in ways that are actually relevant to biodiversity. There's a lot of work on this using machine learning algorithms to identify particular species in recordings. But this survey will actually use a more general way to quantify the complexity of these soundscapes using what is called an acoustic index that doesn't require a bunch of training data to identify species in new ecosystems. Effectively, they're asking at what frequencies and at what times of day do forests that are growing back resemble intact ecosystems? And then what does that tell us about the biodiversity in those forests?
Okay, I think we really need to hear this to really get a sense of what the researchers are listening for. So you brought back some audio. Let's hear it.
Yeah, so I have 3 recordings from the same region of Costa Rica, the Nicoya Peninsula in the northwest of the country. The first recording is from a cow pasture. The second recording is from a forest in the process of growing back. And the third recording is from a well-protected, intact forest. So here we have the pasture.
Okay, I think I hear a cow. Lots of insects.
Pretty sleepy though, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was the pasture. And now here we have a forest that's in the process of growing back.
Is that a howler monkey?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, this is instantly, it's a richer sound.
Okay, but there's a car right there. A car driving past.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the regenerating forests are actually forest fragments that are really near roads or, are surrounded by farms or plantations. So sometimes you hear human-related sounds in these forests as well. They're called anthrophonic sounds. Okay, and here we have the well-protected forest.
So this is like our gold standard for the index you were talking about. Okay, that sounds like howler monkeys again.
I mean, I guess this is why you need machine learning to really tell the difference, because I'm sure that probably is richer. But, and also if you listen to like a year's worth of data from it.
Exactly this point, something to remember is that the patterns researchers are listening for are reflected in averages across thousands of hours of audio. Right. So they aren't really necessarily clear over a few seconds of listening. But I think that even listening to just a few snippets like this really gives a sense of how much biological, ecological information there is encoded in sound.
And it's just beautiful.
It is.
Well, we definitely look forward to reading the feature story that's actually already out about what researchers are learning from listening in, and that'll be linked in our show notes. And now it's time for Life Form of the Week. Rowan, I hear you've been out and about and hanging out with some pretty interesting orchids.
Yeah, I have. Orchids are just coming up in the Northern Hemisphere. You might notice, have you ever noticed that orchids appear in clusters at all?
Honestly, I didn't notice that, but I also have only really experienced orchids as like the kind of houseplant that people get really fanatic about, single plants in pots, gently tended, that kind of thing.
Well, they do. In nature, terrestrial orchids often appear in these clusters. And I've been talking to Katie Field and other botanists at the University of Sheffield, and they think they've figured out what's going on. And it's really fascinating because it's all to do with the mycorrhizal network. And that's the intricate network of fungal threads that join with the roots of almost all plants.
Okay, so yeah, that's like the wood wide web concept, right? That trees have mothers and offspring, sort of like animals. Some people think that maybe these mother trees use the fungal network to communicate and even share resources with offspring.
Yeah, exactly. The concept's gone really wild in popular culture recently. There was Richard Powers' book, Overstory. Did you read that?
I feel like I'm going to just keep saying no when you ask me these things, but if I had a nickel for every time someone recommended that book for me, I'd have a good lunch sandwich.
That many times, eh?
Yeah.
There's that. There's stuff like Avatar. The Tree of Life, connections in Avatar. There's the fungal spore drive in Star Trek Discovery.
That's a storyline that maybe went a bit out of hand, though.
Yeah, it did. So look, but also scientifically, it's got a bit further than the evidence really allows. And there has been a lot of criticism of the wood wide web idea recently, saying, for example, that the evidence that trees share with offspring isn't strong enough.
All right, and I sense a but coming.
Yeah, but there's now evidence for the first time that orchids, they do share with seedlings and that they send food packages through the mycorrhizal network to young orchids.
All right, and that is perhaps why we get orchids growing in clusters, because they're growing around their parent plant.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? They haven't demonstrated that in the wild yet. But the point here is that Katie Field and her colleagues, they showed really nicely that sugars that are made by photosynthesis by an orchid plant, an adult, they get shuttled along this mycorrhizal network to the seedlings. And these seedlings don't have chlorophyll, so they can't make their own sugars by photosynthesis. So it really does seem like there's this sort of parental care package being sent off to the child,
It's like, here's your cookies, you're off to college.
Yeah.
So is this thought to happen in all orchids? Because that would be a lot of species.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's the biggest family of flowering plants. There's more than 25,000 species. So no, we don't know if it's all of them. This has just been done in one study, the common spotted orchid, which is why I picked it for Life Form of the Week.
All right, the common spotted orchid, a very worthy life form of the week. And you've been writing more about it, right, Rowan?
Yeah, it's in the mag this week. I think what's really interesting about this sort of thing is it challenges the kind of language that we use to describe relationships, non-human relationships. Because, who's in charge here? Is it the fungal network or is it the plant? Mm-hmm. And if so, then what, who's nurturing who? So, yeah, that's in the mag this week.
And we'll make sure there's a link in the show notes for you to learn all about it. You are almost certainly familiar with Egypt's pyramids, used to memorialize the dead. And many of them sit along a narrow strip of inhospitable, arid land, including the famous Great Pyramid of Giza. But we know ancient Egyptians were heavily reliant on the Nile River to transport enormous stone blocks for these epic constructions. So this strip of pyramids has been a bit of a mystery, leading archaeologists to wonder if the Nile was perhaps shaped differently thousands of years ago. Well, now, archaeologists have finally found a clue about this theorized channel. Chen Lai has the full details. Hey, Chen.
Hey.
Tell us more about these pyramids, first of all. How did they get made?
Yeah, so like you already mentioned, Egypt is home to many pyramids, more than 100. And they were built between 4,700 and 3,500 years ago as tombs for Egypt's ancient pharaohs. But 31 of these, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, are clustered along that narrow stretch of land that borders the Western Desert, which is part of Africa's Sahara Desert, several kilometers away from the Nile. Now, these pyramids are obviously enormous, so like you mentioned, it takes a huge amount of resources and manpower to build them. Rivers and waterways are usually the most efficient way to transport both people and materials, especially thousands of years ago when the pyramids were first built. So archaeologists had a little inkling that the Nile may have once had a branch much closer to this particular group of pyramids.
That makes a lot of sense, and waterways have been known to move over the course of geologic time. So how do you go about uncovering a dried up old Nile river?
Using a mix of very sophisticated techniques, including radar satellite imagery, high-resolution digital elevation data, and historical maps, which are all used to identify and trace the outline of this river branch, which researchers eventually found lay to the west of where the Nile is located today and close to the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis. Once archaeologists had a rough idea of where this branch was, which they called the Aramat branch after the Arabic word for pyramid, they did on-the-ground analysis of the soil and found that the ancient offshoot of the Nile stretched around 64 kilometers, or around 40 miles, in length and was at least 8 meters deep at its deepest and between 200 and 700 meters wide.
So it makes sense that the ancient Egyptians used this Aramat branch to transport pyramid building materials.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I never thought of this sort of thing before. There kind of must have been a branch of the river there, right? I mean, is there hard evidence for it that they used this?
Yeah, so the geology obviously points to the branch being there, but archaeologists have also found a series of causeways or roads that lead from the Aramat branch to the pyramids. So it's pretty compelling evidence that they used those causeways to transport construction materials to and from the river and the pyramids.
And what happened to this branch of the river since? It just sort of got consumed by the desert.
Yeah, basically. So the team think that a major drought hit the region around 4,200 years ago, which led to the buildup of sand blown by the wind into the river, eventually silting up and drying out. The land where the river branch used to be is now mainly farmland or unused desert. And I think it just all goes to show how important rivers are in shaping civilization. We think of rivers like the Thames or the Nile or, the Mississippi as these kind of vast, enduring, relatively unchanging giants, but they are actually changing their environment all the time. And I think a better understanding of how rivers can change over time really gives us a glimpse of our past and what might actually happen in the future.
That's it for this week. You can read all the stories we've talked about today in the show notes, and of course there's much more like it on our website, newscientist.com.
Plus, if you like the great stories we're bringing you, please give us a rating or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, both of them. Share your favourite stories or just tell your friends. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.